The greenhorn's autumn tonight we return to the quiet frontier, a place far from towns and lantern-lit streets, a land of deep forests and cold rivers, where the wind moves through tall pines and the seasons rule with an unbending hand. Here the wilderness stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, broken only by winding rivers, scattered mountain valleys, and the occasional lonely trail left behind by trappers, traders, and wandering hunters. It is a hard land, but it is also a beautiful one, and for the few who learn its ways, it can offer a life unlike any other. Tonight's story follows a young trapper still learning those ways. His name is William the Trapper. He is not yet an old mountain man with grey in his beard and decades of experience behind him. He is young, barely 22 years of age, and only beginning to understand the quiet, patient rhythm of life in the wilderness. But he is learning, and every day in the mountains teaches him something new. Tonight we find William beside a quiet river deep in the northern forests. Morning has not yet fully arrived. The sky above the mountains is still dark, though the faintest hint of grey has begun creeping upward along the eastern horizon. The forest rests in that strange and peaceful moment between night and day. The air is cold enough that every breath forms a thin cloud before fading into the darkness. A slow river winds through the valley, its dark surface reflecting faint streaks of the waking sky. Mist drifts above the water in thin ribbons that move lazily with the current. Now and then the faint splash of a fish disturbs the quiet surface before the river settles once more into its steady motion. On a small rise above the riverbank, a young trapper sleeps beneath a thick wool blanket. His name is William. He lies curled slightly on his side, one arm tucked beneath his head while the other rests across his chest. Beneath him is a thick bed of spruce boughs he cut the evening before. The flexible branches form a surprisingly comfortable mattress, their soft needles keeping the cold earth from pressing too harshly against his back. Even so, the chill of the mountain night has crept through the blanket. The cold always finds a way. William stirs slightly as the faint grey light of early morning begins to reach the valley. For a moment he remains still, caught somewhere between sleep and waking. Then his eyes slowly open. Above him the tall pine trees rise into the fading night sky, their dark branches swaying gently in a slow mountain breeze. William blinks a few times, his mind slowly remembering where he is. Not in a cabin, not in a town, but deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest settlement. A faint smile spreads across his face. Even after months of trapping, there is still something satisfying about waking up beneath open sky with nothing but forest and river around him. He exhales slowly, watching his breath drift into the cold morning air. Then he pushes himself upright, rubbing his hands across his face. The skin along his lips feels tight and dry from the cold wind that had swept down the valley during the night. He runs his tongue across them and feels the faint sting of a small crack near the corner of his mouth. William chuckles quietly to himself. The sound is rough from sleep. "Winter's coming," he murmurs softly, and in the northern mountains, winter is something every trapper must prepare for long before the first snow ever falls. The morning fire for a few moments William simply sat there, letting the last traces of sleep fade from his mind. The morning air carried a sharp edge of cold that crept easily through wool and leather alike. It bit gently at the tips of his ears and made the skin along his hands feel stiff until he flexed his fingers a few times. This was the kind of cold that warned of the season ahead. Not yet the brutal, bone-deep cold of winter, but a quiet reminder that the mountains were slowly turning toward it. William pulled the blanket from his shoulders and folded it carefully before setting it aside beside his pack. Trappers who lived out of their gear learned quickly that small habits of order could make the difference between comfort and misery. A misplaced blanket might gather frost during the night. A carelessly left pouch of powder might grow damp. Little mistakes had a way of becoming big problems in the wilderness. He stood slowly and stretched again, raising both arms toward the pale sky. His shoulders popped softly. His back followed a moment later. A faint groan escaped him before he chuckled quietly. "Getting old already," he muttered. At 22, he was far from old by any reasonable measure, but months of hauling traps, cutting wood, and walking long miles along rough river banks had a way of making even a young man feel the weight of hard work. Still, William would not have traded the life for anything. He stepped toward the small ring of stones, where last night's fire had burned. The ashes were pale grey now, but he knew better than to assume the fire had died completely. John Whitlock had been very particular about that. William could still remember the old trapper's voice from the previous winter. "Never let a fire die clean," Whitlock had said one evening, while stirring the coals of their cabin hearth. "A lazy man lets the fire go cold. A smart man leaves it sleeping." William crouched beside the stones and picked up a small twig. He gently pushed aside the ash. At first nothing happened. Then a dull red glow appeared beneath the grey dust, still alive. A slow grin spread across William's face. "That's a good start," he said quietly. He stood and walked a short distance into the trees behind camp. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles and damp leaves that muted the sound of his footsteps. Here and there small branches lay scattered where wind or animals had broken them loose from the trees above. William bent and picked one up. He tested it by bending it gently between his hands. The branch snapped cleanly with a sharp crack. Dree. Perfect. A trapper learned quickly how to recognize good firewood. Dry wood snapped. Damp wood bent. The difference could mean the difference between a warm fire and a frustrating morning of smoke and stubborn sparks. William gathered several more small sticks before returning to the fire pit. He knelt again and placed the dry twigs carefully over the glowing coals. For a moment nothing happened. Then a thin thread of smoke curled upward. A second later a small flame flickered to life. William fed it another twig. Then another. Within a minute the little fire had begun to grow. Pine kindling caught, quickly thanks to the resin inside the wood. The flames burned bright and lively, filling the morning air with the familiar sharp scent of pine smoke. William held his hands near the growing warmth and rubbed them together slowly. The heat worked its way into his stiff fingers, bringing a welcome tingling sensation as the blood returned to the skin. Once the flames had grown strong enough, he reached for his small iron kettle. The kettle had travelled with him since he first came west. Its surface was blackened from countless fires, and one side bore a small dent from where it had once fallen against a rock during a long journey through rough country. It was not pretty, but it worked, and on the frontier, that was what mattered. William walked down to the river and knelt along the bank. The water was so clear he could see smooth stones resting along the bottom several feet below the surface. The current slid quietly around his fingers as he dipped the kettle beneath the water. Cold, very cold. Even through the thick skin of his hands, he could feel the bite of molten water, lifted the kettle, and returned to the fire. Setting it carefully over the flames, he settled back onto one of the logs beside the fire pit. For a few minutes he simply watched the water begin to warm. Morning had begun to arrive in earnest now. The eastern sky glowed faintly through the trees. Birdsong slowly replaced the silence of the night. Somewhere nearby a squirrel scolded loudly from the branches above, offended perhaps by William's presence beneath its tree. William smiled faintly at the sound. The wilderness rarely stayed quiet once the sun began to rise. His stomach gave a quiet growl. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see what we've got." He reached for a small cloth sack inside his pack and loosened the drawstring. Inside was coarse yellow cornmeal. Not the most exciting meal in the world, but it filled the belly and travelled well. Cornmeal mush had become a common breakfast for trappers and travellers alike. With a little salt and hot water, it became a thick, hearty meal that could keep a man going for several hours. William poured a small handful into the kettle once the water began to steam. He stirred the mixture slowly with a wooden spoon. The mush thickened quickly. Soon the smell of warm corn drifted through the cool air. He added a pinch of salt from a small lather pouch. Then he set the kettle aside for a moment to cool. While the food rested, William leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. From where he sat he could see a long stretch of river winding through the trees. The morning mist had begun to thin now. Sunlight touched the tops of the pines, and along the muddy banks, signs of the river's busiest residents could be seen everywhere. Beaver. William knew the signs well now. Freshly chewed branches lay scattered near the waterline. Small stumps of willow and cottonwood stood like sharpened stakes where the animals had cut them down, and farther upstream he could see the familiar mound of sticks and mud that marked a beaver lodge rising from the shallows. A trapper could read the riverbank almost like a book once he knew what to look for. Slides where beavers dragged branches into the water. Feeding trails worn through the grass narrow channels where they swam between the lodge and their feeding grounds. William took a slow bite of the cornmeal mush. It was hot enough to make him wince slightly before he blew across the spoon, and tried again. Simple food, but good enough. He stowed as he stowed the river. Soon it would be time to walk the trapline, and with a little luck the morning might bring a few good pelts waiting along the river bank. Walking the trapline, William finished the last few spoonfuls of cornmeal slowly, letting the warmth of the food settle into his stomach. A hot meal in the morning made a noticeable difference once a man began walking the trapline, especially when the air carried the chill of approaching winter. He rinsed the kettle in the river and set it upside down on a flat rock near the fire to dry. Nothing in a trapper's camp stayed dirty for long if it could be helped. Old food drew animals, grease attracted insects. Even small scraps could invite unwelcome visitors during the night. William wiped the spoon clean with a piece of cloth and returned it to his pack. Then he sat quietly for a moment, studying the river once more. The sun had finally crept above the eastern ridge, sending long beams of pale gold light through the forest. The mist along the riverbank began to thin as the warming air slowly lifted it away. It would be a clear day. Good weather for checking traps. William stood and stretched once more before gathering the jaw he would need. His rifle leaned against a nearby tree where he had left it the night before. The long barrel caught the morning light as he lifted it carefully. A trapper's rifle was more than a weapon. It was a tool for survival. With it a man could hunt deer, elk, rabbit, or turkey. In the wrong situation, it could also discourage wolves, or worse, from getting too curious. William checked the flint and the powder pan with practiced movements before slinging the rifle across his shoulder. Satisfied, he reached for the leather sack that held several extra traps. The iron jaws clinked softly together as he lifted them. Steel traps were not light things. Each one carried enough weight to make a long wog, but they were worth the trouble. Years earlier, many trappers had relied on wooden deadfall traps or complicated snare systems made from twisted fibers and rawhide. Those methods still worked well enough, but steel traps had become the preferred tool for most men in the fur trade. They were reliable, strong, and when placed correctly, they rarely failed. William secured the trap sack across his shoulder and took one last glance around camp, blanket folded. Fire burning safely within the stones. Kettle drying. Everything in its place. He nodded once to himself. Then he turned toward the river trail. The path along the bank had formed naturally over the past several days as he walked the same route again and again, checking his traps. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath his boots, while small patches of damp earth still held the faint tracks of animals that had passed during the night. William moved slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the ground. The forest was full of information for anyone patient enough to read it. Near the edge of the trail, a pair of narrow hoof prints pressed into the mud. Deer. Judging by the depth of the tracks and the distance between them, the animal had likely passed through some time during the night while the ground was still damp with evening dew. William crouched slightly to examine them. He followed the direction of the prints for a few yards before they disappeared into thicker brush. Good to know. Deer meant meat if he ever needed it, and in winter knowing where the deer travelled could make the difference between hunger and comfort. He stood again and continued along the river. The sound of moving water stayed constant beside him. Occasionally the current carried drifting leaves past the bank like small boats travelling downstream. William reached the first trap within a few minutes, and slowed his steps. A trapper learned early not to rush the moment of checking a set. The condition of the trap told a story, and it was best to read that story before disturbing anything. The trap had been placed in a narrow channel of water, where beavers often swam along the bank before reaching their lodge. William knelt carefully and leaned forward. The chain leading from the trap stretched tight into the water. A small ripple disturbed the surface. William allowed himself a quiet breath of satisfaction. That's promising, he murmured. He rolled up the sleeve of his coat and reached his hand into the cold river. The water bit immediately at his skin. Even this early in the season, mountain water stayed cold enough to make a man regret careless movements. His fingers followed the chain until they reached the trap itself. With a slow pull he lifted the iron jaws from the water. A large beaver hung firmly caught. The animal's thick brown fur glistened in the morning light. William smiled. A good catch. Beaver fur was among the most valuable pelts in the entire frontier trade. The dense underfur could be processed into felt used for making high-quality hats across Europe and the eastern cities. That demand had driven thousands of trappers west into the wilderness. Men like William, men like Whitlock, men chasing both adventure and the quiet promise of profit. William carefully removed her on the bank. The animal was heavy nearly 40 pounds if he had to guess. A fine specimen. He reset the trap with practiced movements, positioning it exactly where it had been before. The beavers were creatures of habit, followed familiar routes through the water, and returned to the same place night after night. A well-placed trap could produce several catches over the course of a season. William secured the chain again, and brushed a little mud across the metal to dull its shine. Then he stood, lifting the beaver by its hind legs. The animal's broad flat tail long, slightly as he slung it across his shoulder. "One down," he said quietly. The river continued whispering beside him as he started toward the next trap, and if the rest of the line held as well as the first, it might prove to be a very good morning indeed. A good morning's work. William continued along the river bank with the beaver resting across his shoulder. The animal was heavier than it first appeared. Its thick fur held moisture from the river, and the solid weight of muscle and bone settled against his back with each step he took. But William did not mind the burden. A heavy beaver meant a valuable pelt, and a valuable pelt meant supplies when the spring trading caravans arrived. The trail curved gently along the river, weaving between tall cottonwoods and clusters of alder that grew thick near the water's edge. Fallen leaves covered the ground in shades of yellow and rust, their dry surfaces crunching softly beneath William's boots. The morning sun had climbed higher now, sending thin beams of light between the trees. Here and there small clouds of breath still drifted from William's mouth as he walked. The air remained cold, not yet the harsh cold of winter, but cold enough that a man could feel it settling slowly into his bones if he stood still for too long. William shifted the beaver slightly on his shoulder and continued downriver. The second trap waited another 100 yards ahead. He approached it more slowly this time, careful not to disturb the area too quickly. Experience, even the small amount William had gained so far, had taught him that rushing a trap often meant missing small clues, and small clues often meant the difference between success and an empty line. He crouched near the bank and studied the water. The trap chain disappeared beneath the surface, but this time it hung loose. The water moved calmly around it. William leaned closer. No disturbance. No ripples. He nodded quietly to himself. Empty, he murmured. That happened often enough. Sometimes a beaver swam past without touching the trap. Sometimes drifting sticks triggered the jaws too early. And sometimes a clever animal simply avoided the set entirely. William reached into the water and lifted the trap carefully. The jaws were still open, a good sign. He adjusted the position slightly, making sure the pan sat exactly where a swimming beaver would naturally place its foot. Then he pressed a handful of river mud over the metal to disguise its outline. Satisfied, he stood again. The beaver on his shoulder shifted slightly as he straightened. "Let's see about the next one," he said quietly. The trail narrowed as he continued along the riverbank. Tall grass brushed against his boots, while thin branches tugged gently at the sleeves of his coat. Birds flitted between the trees overhead. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker tapped steadily against a hollow trunk, the sound echoing faintly through the valley. William listened absently as he walked. The wilderness always carried sounds like that, small rhythms that blended together until they became part of the day itself. After a few minutes he reached the third trap. Even before he crouched beside the water he noticed something different. The chain stretched tight again, and the surface of the water trembled slightly. William smiled. "Well now," he said under his breath. He knelt carefully and reached into the river once more. The cold water wrapped around his wrist as his fingers followed the chain downward. A moment later he lifted the trap from the shallows. Another beaver, smaller than the first, but still a good catch. William set the animal beside the first on the bank and reset the trap again. 2 pelts already. Not a bad start to the morning. He stood and stretched his back slightly before lifting both animals. One went across each shoulder now, their thick fur brushing against the back of his coat. The weight was noticeable, but manageable. William began the walk back toward camp. As he moved along the riverbank, he allowed his thoughts to wander. Mornings like this always reminded him of his first winter in the mountains. Whitlock had been the one to teach him how to set his earliest traps. The old trapper had stood beside a quiet stream much like this one, while William struggled to position a trap correctly. Whitlock had watched for a long moment before finally shaking his head. "Too obvious," he had said. William remembered, frowning at the time. "What do you mean?" Whitlock had crouched beside the water and moved the trap just a few inches. "Animals notice things," the old trapper explained. "Not the way we do, but they notice enough." He brushed mud over the metal. "If it looks wrong, they'll avoid it." Then Whitlock had glanced up with a faint grin beneath his grey beard. "Trapping ain't about forcing the animal into your trap. It's about putting the trap where the animal was already going." William chuckled quietly as he remembered the moment. Whitlock had always had a way of turning simple lessons into things worth remembering. The river curved again ahead, marking the final stretch of William's trap line. One more set waited there before he returned to camp. The trail dipped slightly downhill toward the water. William slowed his steps as he approached. For a moment he thought the trap might be empty. Then he noticed something else. The chain moved. Not much, just a small tremble beneath the surface of the water. William crouched slowly. He leaned forward and reached into the river once again. The chain led downward toward the trap. But as his fingers touched the metal, something shifted in the water nearby. William froze. The movement had not come from the beaver. Something else had disturbed the water just upstream. He lifted his head slowly and listened. The forest had gone strangely quiet. No birds. No tapping woodpecker. Even the wind seemed to pause among the trees. William stayed still for a moment longer. Then he slowly turned his eyes toward the opposite bank. Something had moved there. Just beyond the thin line of willows that grew along the water, he could not see clearly through the branches. But the feeling of being watched crept quietly into the back of his mind. William remained crouched beside the river, his hand still resting on the trap chain beneath the cold water. The wilderness had many ways of reminding a man that he was never truly alone, and sometimes it paid to listen before making the next move. The quiet watcher William stayed crouched beside the river for several long seconds. The cold water pressed against his wrist where his hand still rested on the trap chain. Normally he would have pulled it free immediately, eager to see what waited beneath the surface. But now he did not move. Something about the forest had changed. It was a small thing. But a man who spent enough time in the wilderness eventually learned to notice such changes. The birds had gone quiet. Even the breeze that had been rustling through the leaves seemed to have faded for the moment. William slowly lifted his hand from the water. Droplets slid down his sleeve as he wiped his fingers against his coat. Then, very carefully, he stood. His rifle remained slung across his shoulder, but he did not reach for it. Not yet. He simply watched the opposite bank. The willows there grew thick and tangled, their thin branches swaying gently above the river. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in narrow beams. The will occurred across the water's surface. For a moment, nothing happened. William began to wonder if he had imagined the movement. Then he saw it again. A flicker of grey between the branches, low to the ground, moving slowly. William relaxed slightly. "Ah," he said quietly. A wolf stepped from the shadows of the willows. The animal paused near the edge of the water, its narrow muzzle lifted slightly as it sniffed the air. Its coat was a mixture of grey and brown, thickening already for the colder months ahead. The wolf looked across the river toward William, not aggressive, not afraid, simply curious. William had seen wolves many times since coming west. Most of the time they kept their distance from humans. A healthy grown man was not easy prey, and wolves were far too clever to risk injury over something uncertain. Still, they were always watching, studying. Learning, the wolf took a few slow steps along the bank before lowering its head to drink from the river. William remained perfectly still. The animal's ears twitched once, then again. But after a moment it seemed satisfied that the strange figure across the water posed no immediate threat. The wolf finished drinking and turned back toward the trees. Within seconds it had disappeared once more into the forest. William let out a quiet breath. "Well," he murmured, "that answers that." Encounters like that were common enough in the wilderness. Still, they always reminded him of something Whitlock had said during his first winter. The old trapper had been sitting beside the cabin fire, sharpening his knife, when a distant wolf howl echoed through the snowy hills. Whitlock had paused for a moment before speaking. "Wolves ain't your enemy," he had said. "They're just another hunter trying to survive." Then he had looked toward the door of the cabin. "But remember this. If wolves are nearby, it means something else is alive out there too." At the time William had not fully understood the lesson. Now he did. Where wolves travelled, prey animals were never far away, and prey animals meant food. William knelt beside the river once more. The trap chain still stretched tight beneath the water. "Let's see what you've got for me," he said quietly. He reached into the cold current and followed the chain again. A moment later he lifted the trap free. Another beaver. This one was smaller than the others, but still worth taking. William nodded with satisfaction. "Three's a fine morning's work." He reset the trap carefully, pressing mud over the metal, just as Whitlock had taught him. Then he lifted the third beaver and added it to the others across his shoulders. The combined weight made him lean forward slightly as he straightened. 3 animals now hung across his back. The thick fur brushed against his coat while their broad tails swayed with each step. It would make the walk back to camp slower. But William did not mind. This was the kind of work he had come west to do, the kind of work that made the long months of wilderness life worthwhile. He turned and began walking back along the river trail. The forest had returned to its normal rhythm. Now, birds called again from the branches overhead. The breeze moved gently through the leaves. Somewhere behind him the wolf likely continued its own quiet hunt through the trees. William walked steadily, the weight of the beavers settling comfortably across his shoulders. When he reached camp, the real work would begin: skinning, stretching, preparing the pelts for drying. It was careful work that demanded patience, but patience was something the wilderness had already begun teaching him. And with each passing day in the mountains, William the trapper was learning more about the life he had chosen, one lesson at a time. Preparing the pelts, the walk back to camp took longer than the walk out. 3 beavers resting across William's shoulders added a steady weight that made every step sink slightly deeper into the soft earth of the trail. The animals were solid things, built for water and winter, their bodies thick with muscle and wrapped in dense fur that trapped both warmth and river water. Still, William moved at a comfortable pace. There was no reason to hurry. Life in the wilderness rarely rewarded rushing. The river accompanied him the entire way, whispering beside the trail as it wound through the trees. The sunlight had grown stronger now, filtering down through the tall pines and scattering across the forest floor in shifting patches of gold. When William reached the small clearing that held his camp, the fire he had left behind still burned steadily within its ring of stones. He lowered the beavers carefully onto the ground beside the fire pit. For a moment he simply stood there, rolling his shoulders slowly as the tension left his back. Carrying weight like that always reminded him how quickly the wilderness could wear a man down if he wasn't careful. Whitlock had once said something similar. Work hard, the old trapper had told him. But work steady. A tired man makes mistakes. William flexed his hands and then knelt beside the animals. The work of preparing pelts was not difficult, but it required patience and care. He reached for his knife. The blade was simple but well maintained. William had sharpened it the evening before, running the steel slowly across a whetstone until the edge felt clean and smooth beneath his thumb. A dull knife made skinning far harder than it needed to be. William rolled the first beaver onto its back. The animal's thick fur felt coarse beneath his fingers, the undercoat dense and soft where the longer guard hairs parted. Beaver pelts were prized for exactly that reason. Beneath the rough outer hairs lay an incredibly fine layer of soft fur that could be pressed into felt. That felt was then shaped into hats worn in cities thousands of miles away from this quiet river. Men in London, men in Paris, men who likely never imagined the forests where their fashionable hats had begun. William began the careful work of skinning. He made a clean cut along the underside of the animal, guiding the blade slowly while keeping the edge just beneath the surface of the hide. Too deep, and he would cut into the pelt itself. Too shallow, and the skin would refuse to separate cleanly. He worked slowly, peeling the hide away from the muscle beneath. The process required steady hands and a bit of patience, but William had grown comfortable with it over the past year. The first time he had tried it under Whitlock's watchful eye, things had not gone nearly as smoothly. William remembered that moment clearly. The hide had torn near the shoulder, leaving a ragged edge where the knife slipped. Whitlock had watched quietly for a moment before shaking his head. "Too quick," he had said. Then he had crouched beside William and taken the knife. "Skinning a race. It's more like peeling bark from a tree." Whitlock had carefully guided along the hide, showing how the knife should glide rather than force its way through. Let the hide tell you where it wants to separate. That lesson had stayed with William. Now he worked with slow confidence, pulling the hide loose a little at a time until the entire pelt came free. He stretched it gently between his hands. The oval shape looked clean, no tears, no jagged cuts. A good pelt. William nodded to himself. He set the hide aside and moved on to the next animal. The sun climbed higher as he worked. The forest warmed slightly, though the air still carried the cool breath of autumn. Birds hopped among the branches above his camp while a curious squirrel crept down a nearby tree trunk to watch the strange activity below. By the time William finished skinning the third beaver, the fire had burned down into a bed of glowing coals. He wiped his knife clean on a cloth and stretched his back again. Now came the next step, drying the pelts. William walked to the edge of the clearing where several wooden boards leaned against a fallen log. They were simple things. Flat pieces of wood shaped roughly like wide paddles. Trappers called them stretching boards. Once a pelt was cleaned and trimmed, it could be pulled over the board and pinned into place. As the hide dried, it would tighten naturally, leaving a smooth uniform shape that traders preferred when purchasing furs. William lifted the first board and laid the pelt over it. He worked the edges outward carefully, pulling the hide until it stretched evenly across the wood. Then he used small wooden pegs to secure the edges in place. The hide tightened slightly as it settled. Perfect. He repeated the process with the other two pelts. Soon 3 fresh beaver hides rested against the fallen log, their pale inner surfaces catching the sunlight as they began the slow process of drying. William stepped back to examine them. 3 good pelts, a fine morning's work indeed. But as he wiped his hands clean and turned back toward the fire, a cool breeze drifted down from the northern hills. It carried a sharper edge than the morning air had. William felt it immediately, the kind of wind that spoke of higher mountains and colder places. He glanced toward the distant ridgeline beyond the trees. The leaves there had already begun turning dull shades of gold and red. Autumn was moving quickly, too quickly perhaps. William folded his arms and studied the hills. His small riverside camp had served him well for trapping these past weeks. But it would not survive the winter. Not the kind of winter these mountains could bring. For that, he would need something stronger. A cabin. And judging by the way that cold wind slid through the valley, he might need to start building it sooner than he had planned. Looking toward winter, William stood quietly for a few moments, watching the distant ridge beyond the trees. The breeze moved steadily now, sliding down from the higher country to the north. It stirred the branches above his camp and carried the dry scent of fallen leaves across the clearing. Autumn had settled fully into the valley. The signs were everywhere. The river ran colder. The nights grew longer, and the animals had begun their quiet preparations for the winter ahead. William had seen beavers hauling fresh branches toward their lodge along the river. Squirrels busied themselves gathering nuts and hiding them among the roots of old trees. Even the birds had begun changing their patterns, some disappearing entirely as they started the long journey south. The wilderness always knew when winter was coming, and any trapper who hoped to survive in these mountains needed to know it too. William walked slowly to the fire and crouched beside the coals. He added 2 small pieces of oak from the woodpile he had gathered the day before. The hardwood caught slowly, the flames licking cautiously along the rough bark before beginning to burn with a deeper, steadier heat than the pine kindling he had used earlier. Whitlock had explained that difference many times. Pine starts a fire, the old trapper had once said, but oak keeps it alive. William watched the flames settle into a slow burn. The warmth felt good against his hands, but his thoughts remained on the ridge beyond the trees. A lean-to and blanket were enough during the warmer months of autumn, but winter was another matter entirely. Snow in the mountains could pile deep enough to bury trails and hide rivers beneath thick ice. Temperatures could drop so low that a man's breath froze along the edges of his beard. William had experienced only one winter here so far, and he had not faced it alone. Whitlock had shared a small log cabin with him that season. The cabin had been little more than 12 feet wide, with a low roof and a stone fireplace built along the back wall. But inside those rough logs the 2 men had stayed warm through storms that buried the valley in snow. William could still picture the cabin clearly. The creak of the wooden door, the smell of smoke drifting from the stone chimney, the steady crackle of firewood burning inside the hearth, while wind howled outside through the dark forest. Whitlock had built that cabin himself years before, and during the winter he had shown William every detail of how such shelters were made. How to choose straight trees, how to notch the ends of logs so they locked together tightly, how to pack moss into the cracks between the wood to keep the cold wind from creeping inside. William remembered one particular evening when Whitlock had been crouched beside the cabin wall stuffing handfuls of green moss into a narrow gap between the logs. William had asked why it mattered so much. "The logs look tight enough," he had said. Whitlock had chuckled softly. "Cold air's clever," he replied. "It'll find every little hole you leave." He pressed another handful of moss deeper into the crack. "You want to stay warm in winter. Make sure the wind can't get in." William smiled faintly at the memory. Those lessons had seemed simple at the time. Now they felt much more important. He stood again and looked around his small camp. The lean-to was nothing more than a canvas sheet stretched between 2 trees. It worked well enough for keeping dew off his blanket and blocking a little wind during the night. But a real mountain winter would tear something like that apart in a matter of days. William rubbed his chin thoughtfully. A cabin. Yes, that would have to come next. But building one required careful planning. The location mattered. A good cabin site needed several things: strong trees nearby for building, a reliable source of fresh water, and enough open ground to keep snow from piling too deeply against the walls. William glanced toward the stream he had discovered the previous afternoon while scouting the hills above the river. The small creek ran clear and steady even this late in the season. It flowed down from higher ground, winding through a stand of tall pine trees before joining the river, not far from his trapline. That place might work well for a winter shelter, high enough above the valley floor to avoid flooding when spring thaw arrived, and surrounded by enough timber to build a strong cabin. William nodded slowly. Yes, that would do. He turned back toward the fire and gathered another piece of wood, tossing it gently onto the coals. The flames flared briefly before settling again into their steady burn. The rest of the day would give him time to think. There were still traps along the river to check again later, and the pelts drying against the log would need turning once the sun moved farther west. But tomorrow he would begin scouting the hills more carefully, choosing the exact place where his cabin would stand, because once the first real snow arrived, travel through the mountains would become far more difficult, and if William intended to survive the winter ahead, he would need those walls built before the cold truly arrived. The fire crackled softly beside him as he stood there, thinking of the trees. The sky had turned a deep, clear blue, a beautiful autumn day in the mountains. But William knew better than to trust autumn too much. Winter was already on its way, and the wilderness always demanded that a man prepare long before the storm clouds appeared. Afternoon work around camp. The fire burned steadily beside William, while the afternoon sun climbed higher above the valley. The warmth felt pleasant now. The chill that had lingered in the early morning air had softened slightly. though the breeze that drifted down from the northern hills still carried a faint hint of colder days ahead. William stepped over to the log where the 3 beaver pelts rested on their stretching boards. Drying hides required attention. If a pelt dried unevenly, it could wrinkle or curl in ways that made traders less willing to pay full value for it. A careful trapper checked his pelts often during the first few hours, making small adjustments as the hide tightened. William lifted one edge gently. The hide had already begun to stiffen slightly beneath the warmth of the sun. Good. He adjusted one of the small wooden pegs and pulled the edge a little tighter across the board before setting it back against the log. The other 2 pelts looked just as good. 3 clean hides. A fine start to the day's work. William brushed his hands together and stepped back toward the fire. His stomach reminded him that breakfast had been small, but that could wait until evening. There was still plenty of daylight left, and the wilderness always offered more work than hours to complete it. He glanced toward the small stack of firewood beside camp. The pile was respectable enough for a few days of mild weather, but winter preparation required far more than that. Whitlock had once explained it very plainly. "Cut 3 times more wood than you think you'll need," the old trapper had said. "Then cut some more after that." William had laughed at the time. Now he understood the wisdom in the advice. Cold weather had a way of devouring firewood faster than a man expected, and when snow buried the forest floor and storms raged through the valley, leaving camp to gather more wood could become dangerous work. Better to gather plenty early. William reached for his hatchet. The tool rested beside a tree stump where he had left it the previous evening. Its wooden handle was smooth from use, and the iron head still held a keen edge. A hatchet might have been the most useful tool a trapper carried. With it a man could build shelter, split kindling, cut stakes, shape tools, and clear branches from trails. William tested the weight in his hand before turning toward the trees behind camp. The forest floor was scattered with fallen limbs from older storms. Wind often broke small branches from the pines during rough weather, leaving dry wood waiting for anyone patient enough to gather it. He walked slowly through the trees, studying the ground carefully. A good firewood gatherer looked for wood that had already dried naturally. Branches that rested slightly above the soil were often best. If wood lay directly against damp ground, it tended to absorb moisture and burn poorly. William found a suitable branch and lifted it. He bent it gently between his hands. It snapped with a sharp crack perfect. He broke the branch into several manageable pieces and carried them back toward camp. The hatchet made quick work of splitting the thicker sections into smaller sticks for kindling. Soon a fresh pile of wood began growing beside the fire pit. William worked steadily. Walk into the forest, find a dry branch, carry it back, split it into smaller pieces, stack it neatly beside the others. The rhythm of the work felt calm and familiar. Sunlight moved slowly across the clearing while the afternoon passed in quiet labor. Once while gathering another armful of wood, William paused near the edge of the riverbank. Fresh tracks marked the damp soil near the water. He crouched to examine them. Raccoon. The small hand-like prints showed clearly where the animal had wandered along the shore some time earlier that morning. Raccoons were clever creatures. Whitlock had warned him once that they were capable of stealing nearly anything left unattended near a camp. William chuckled softly. "Not today," he muttered. He brushed the dirt lightly over the tracks and stood again. The forest stretched peacefully around him. Occasionally a bird passed overhead. A squirrel darted across a fallen log nearby, its bushy tail flicking behind it like a banner. Otherwise the valley remained quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that made a man forget the worries of distant towns and busy roads. By mid-afternoon the woodpile beside William's fire had nearly doubled in size. He set the final armful down and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Even in cool weather, steady work warmed the body quickly. William leaned the hatchet against the stump and stretched his arms again. His muscles felt pleasantly tired now, the kind of tired that came from honest work. He glanced once more toward the hills rising beyond the river. Somewhere up there would stand his winter cabin. The thought settled quietly in his mind as he looked across the valley. Tomorrow he would go searching again, and soon after that, the real work of building would begin. Into the hills by late afternoon the light in the valley had begun to soften. The bright gold of midday sunlight faded into longer shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air cooled slightly as the sun drifted closer to the western ridge line, and a calm stillness settled over the river once again. William stood beside his campfire and studied the hills rising beyond the far bank. The thought of a winter cabin had stayed with him all afternoon. A trapper could not ignore winter in these mountains. Snow would come. It always did. And once the heavy storms began rolling through the valley, travel became slow and difficult. Deep drifts could bury trails entirely. Rivers froze. Animals changed their habits. A man caught unprepared could quickly find himself in trouble. William picked up his rifle again and slung it over his shoulder. He was not planning to travel far, just a short look into the hills before sunset. The stream he had discovered the day before seemed promising, and he wanted another look before choosing the exact place where his cabin might stand. He crossed the narrow stretch of river using a line of flat stones that jutted above the surface. The water slipped quietly around his boots as he stepped from one rock to the next. Even through the thick leather he could feel the cold radiating upward from the current. Once across, he began climbing the gentle slope toward the forest above the valley. The ground changed quickly as he moved uphill. The thick grasses along the riverbank gave way to pine needles and patches of moss that covered the earth like a soft green carpet. Tall trees rose around him, their trunks straight and strong. Many of them would make excellent building logs if he chose to cut them. William paused beside one particularly tall pine. He rested a hand against the bark. The trunk was thick, nearly the width of his chest. Good timber. A cabin built from trees like this could stand for years. Whitlock had once told him that choosing the right trees mattered almost as much as the way they were cut. Straight logs make strong walls, the old trapper had said. Crooked ones make crooked cabins. William smiled faintly at the memory and continued walking. The forest grew quieter as he climbed. The sounds of the river faded behind him until only the rustling of wind in the pine branches remained. After several minutes he heard the gentle trickle of running water ahead. The small stream appeared between two mosaiced rocks, wending its way downhill toward the river valley. William followed its course for a short distance. The water ran clear and steady. Even this late in the season the stream showed no sign of drying up. That was important. A cabin without a nearby water source quickly became inconvenient. Once snow began falling, William stepped onto a small rise overlooking the stream. Here the forest opened slightly. A flat patch of ground spread between the trees, large enough to build a modest cabin without much clearing. He turned slowly, studying the area. Tall pines surrounded the clearing on three sides. The stream ran only a short walk away, and the ground sloped gently enough that winter snow would likely slide away from the cabin walls, instead of piling too deeply. William nodded thoughtfully. This place would do nicely. He walked to the center of the clearing and stood there for a moment, imagining what it might look like once the cabin stood finished. 4 sturdy log walls, a small door facing the morning sun, a stone fireplace along the back, perhaps even a small window if he found the right piece of glass during the spring trading trip. William chuckled quietly at that thought. A window might be asking a bit much, still, the idea was pleasant. He paced the clearing slowly, measuring the space with his steps. 10 feet across, maybe 12. That was about the size of Whitlock's old cabin, plenty of room for a bed, a small table, and the fireplace. Enough to stay warm during the long winter nights. Satisfied, William knelt and picked up a small stick from the ground. He pressed it into the soil at the center of the clearing. A simple marker, but enough to remind him exactly where he had chosen to build. Right here, he said quietly. The breeze moved softly through the trees above him. William stood and took one last look around the clearing. The forest felt calm, peaceful, the kind of place where a man might spend a long winter without too much trouble. But the sun had already begun dipping toward the horizon. The valley below would grow dark soon. William turned and began walking back toward the river. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Logs would need cutting. Notches would need carving. And before long the first walls of his winter cabin would rise among the pines. For now, though, evening was approaching, and the fire waiting beside his camp would soon need tending once again. Evening beside the fire by the time William reached the river again. The sun had already begun sinking behind the western ridge. The light in the valley had taken on that deep golden colour that comes only in the last hour before sunset. Long shadows stretched between the trees and the surface of the river, reflected streaks of orange and red where the sky showed through the branches above. William stepped carefully across the same stones he had used earlier in the afternoon. The water moved quietly around his boots again, cold and steady, flowing south through the valley toward places far beyond these mountains. When he reached his side of the river, the small clearing of his camp came into view. The fire still glowed faintly within its circle of stones, though the flames had faded down into a bed of warm coals during his absence. William set his rifle against the tree where it usually rested and knelt beside the fire. He stirred the coals gently with a stick. Bright red light glowed beneath the ash, still alive. He added several pieces of the new firewood he had gathered earlier that afternoon. The dry oak caught slowly, sending small flames rising upward once again. Soon the fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the clearing. The warmth felt welcome as the evening air began cooling quickly. Autumn nights arrived early in the mountains. William walked over to the log where the pelts rested. The hides had dried nicely in the afternoon sun. They had stiffened slightly now, their pale inner surfaces smooth against the stretching boards. He turned each one carefully, checking that the edges remained tight against the pegs. 3 good pelts. A successful day's trapping. William leaned them safely against a tree where the firelight and the gentle evening breeze could continue the drying process overnight. Once that was finished, he returned to the fire. His stomach reminded him again that breakfast had been small. This time he listened. William filled the kettle once more and placed it over the flames. From his pack he pulled a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were strips of salted pork. Salt pork had been a common food for travellers and trappers for generations. The heavy salt preserved the meat for long journeys, allowing it to last months without spoiling. The flavour was strong, very strong, but once cooked over a fire it made a filling meal. William cut a small piece and dropped it into the kettle with a handful of cornmeal. The mixture simmered slowly, sending the smell of warm food drifting through the clearing. While it cooked, William leaned back against a log beside the fire. The forest around him had begun changing again as night approached. Daytime birds had grown quiet. In their place came the sounds of evening. A distant owl called somewhere among the trees. Insects chirped softly along the river bank. The breeze moved slowly through the branches above, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke upward into the darkening sky. William ate his supper slowly once the kettle cooled. The food was simple, but filling, and after a long day of walking, trapping, skinning, and gathering wood, it tasted just fine. When he finished, he rinsed the kettle once more and placed it upside down beside the fire to dry. The sky above the valley had grown darker now. One by one the first stars began appearing between the branches of the tall pines. William leaned back against the log and folded his arms across his chest. He always liked this part of the day. The quiet hour when work was finished and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. Whitlock had once said something about nights like this. The two of them had been sitting beside the cabin fire during a long winter storm when the old trapper spoke. "Out here," Whitlock had said, "a man learns something townsfolk never do." William had looked up. "What's that?" Whitlock had gestured toward the dark woods outside the cabin. How to be comfortable with quiet. William understood that now. The wilderness had a way of teaching patience, teaching stillness, teaching a man how to sit beside a fire and simply listen to the world around him. William watched the flames dance slowly among the firewood. Tomorrow would be another busy day. He would return to the clearing in the hills, begin cutting the first trees for his cabin. It would be hard work, but it was good work, the kind of work that built a life in the wilderness. For now, though, the fire burned warmly beside him. The stars shone above the dark forest, and the slow river continued its endless journey through the valley. William the trapper pulled his blanket around his shoulders and settled beside the fire. Winter was coming, but tonight the frontier was peaceful, and sleep would come easily beneath the quiet mountain sky.